Imagine casting a fishing line into glass calm water when sirens suddenly shatter the morning, red and blue lights flashing like an accusation you never expected. That was the moment I realized a peaceful sunrise had turned into a legal nightmare, all because a homeowners association believed they owned everything their rules could reach. They called the cops on me for fishing, confident I was trespassing, convinced power was on their side. What they did not know, what would soon cost them millions, was that the entire lake was legally mine. I stood there quietly while neighbors gathered, phones raised, whispers spreading faster than ripples across the water. The HOA president arrived first, furious, rehearsed, and certain. She shouted about bylaws, community property, and fines that would bury me. Her certainty was contagious. Even the police officers stepping out of their cars looked at me like I was already guilty. In that moment, I understood how quickly perception becomes judgment when authority speaks loudly enough. But this story did not begin with flashing lights. It began years earlier, with a single line in a property listing that most buyers would ignore. Shared lake access, it said. Something about that phrase felt wrong. Instead of trusting assumptions, I asked questions. I hired surveyors. I requested archived deeds. I read county records older than the neighborhood itself. Page by page, the truth surfaced quietly, patiently, waiting to be noticed. The lake was never communal. It had been privately deeded decades before the HOA existed, its ownership passing legally and cleanly through records no one bothered to check. I paid taxes on it. I maintained it. I protected it. I simply never announced it, because peace felt easier than conflict. What I could not predict was how fragile authority becomes when challenged. One accusation turned neighbors into spectators, rules into weapons, and confidence into confrontation. The lake reflected more than the sky that morning, it reflected how quickly people side with whoever sounds official. That realization stayed with me as the officers approached, hands resting near their belts, ready to act. Standing there with police lights reflecting off the water, I realized silence had allowed a lie to grow powerful. The HOA had enforced rules, hosted events, and even promised access they never owned. And now, with one phone call, they had forced the truth into daylight. What followed would dismantle reputations, erase an HOA, and trigger an $8.2 million mistake no one could undo. This was no longer about fishing. It was about ownership, arrogance, and the moment unchecked authority meets documented truth that would change everything forever, in ways no one expected at all, starting that very morning for everyone involved here. The officers walked toward me with the calm certainty of people who believed the situation had a simple ending. One asked for my identification. The other glanced at the lake and said the HOA claimed I was trespassing on community property. His tone wasn't aggressive, just routine, as if this were already settled. Around us, neighbors murmured, confident they were about to witness someone being put in their place. I handed over my ID without argument. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. That seemed to confuse everyone. The HOA president stepped closer, explaining rules with dramatic flair, pointing at printed bylaws like scripture. She insisted I had been warned before, even though I hadn't. Her confidence grew with every nod from the crowd. When the officer finished checking my license, I asked one simple question. Before you decide anything, may I show you documentation? He paused, then nodded. That pause was the first crack. I walked to my truck and returned with a thick folder, edges worn from years of being opened and closed. The moment the HOA president saw it, her expression changed. She scoffed, loudly claiming papers didn't matter because everyone knows the lake belongs to the community. That sentence would later become important. The officers stepped aside to review what I handed them. Deeds. Parcel maps. Tax records. Surveyor stamps. Official county seals. Each page was quiet, factual, and devastating. Minutes passed. The lake stayed still. The crowd grew uncomfortable. One officer made a call to county records to verify parcel numbers. The HOA president didn't stop talking. She accused me of forging documents, of trying to scam the neighborhood, of intimidating the board. Her voice rose as her certainty fell. Another board member arrived and demanded I leave immediately. When I didn't move, he reached for my fishing rod. That was when the officer intervened and told him to step back. The phone call ended. The officer returned with a different posture. He looked at the HOA president and asked her for proof of ownership. She had none. She offered tradition, usage, assumption. None of those counted. The officer explained, calmly and clearly, that based on county records, I was the legal owner of the lake. Not partially. Not jointly. Fully. He warned the HOA that continued interference could be considered harassment. Silence replaced confidence. Neighbors stopped filming. Board members whispered urgently. The power dynamic shifted so suddenly it felt unreal. What had started as a public shaming attempt ended as a quiet warning, not to me, but to them. As the police left, the HOA promised lawyers, fines, and consequences. They believed authority could still fix this. They had no idea they had just created a problem far bigger than fishing, one that would follow them into courtrooms, bank accounts, and history. Because when power challenges truth and loses, it rarely walks away quietly. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation, but inside my house, everything was calm and deliberate. I laid the documents across my table one by one, checking them the way I always had. The deed clearly described the lake bed boundaries. The survey maps matched perfectly. Tax receipts showed uninterrupted payments for years. Nothing had changed except that the truth was now visible, and visibility makes people reckless. The next morning, recklessness arrived in the form of a certified letter. The HOA's attorney accused me of unauthorized use of community property and demanded I immediately cease fishing and vacate the lake area. The irony was almost impressive. They hadn't verified ownership before calling the police, and now they hadn't verified it before threatening legal action. Confidence had replaced caution, and it was about to cost them dearly. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, a man who had spent decades untangling property disputes caused by assumptions. He called me within the hour. "They're panicking," he said. "And panicking people make expensive mistakes." He drafted a response that was short, factual, and mercilessly precise. It included certified copies of the deed, proof of tax payments, and a formal demand that the HOA stop misrepresenting ownership of the lake in any form. Instead of backing down, the HOA escalated. An emergency meeting notice went out to every homeowner claiming I was attempting to steal a vital community asset. The language was dramatic, urgent, and inaccurate. Fear spread quickly. Homeowners demanded answers. The board promised solutions they did not have. In their rush to regain control, they crossed a line that could not be erased. Without consulting homeowners or verifying ownership, the HOA entered negotiations with a private investor. They promised exclusive lake rights for a luxury expansion project, complete with docks, branding, and restricted access. To secure the deal, they accepted a large advance payment and used the lake as a central asset in the agreement. On paper, it looked bold. In reality, it was catastrophic. My attorney discovered the agreement during a routine records search. When he called me, his voice was steady but sharp. "They've done something very serious," he said. The HOA had sold rights to property they did not own. That wasn't just negligence. It was misrepresentation with financial consequences. The moment the investor learned the truth, the damage would multiply. Contracts would collapse. Lawsuits would follow. And the HOA board members who signed their names would not be shielded by bylaws or titles. The lake was no longer just a source of conflict. It had become a liability worth millions. and the people who once called the cops with confidence were now standing on the edge of a financial disaster they created themselves, without realizing how close the impact really was. The investor didn't discover the truth through rumor or accusation. They discovered it through paperwork, which made it impossible to ignore. Their legal team requested confirmation of ownership before releasing the next phase of funding, a standard safeguard the HOA never anticipated. When county records were pulled, the story collapsed instantly. The lake listed in glossy brochures and investment projections did not belong to the HOA at all. It belonged to me. Within 48 hours, tension rippled through the neighborhood again, this time without police lights. Black vehicles parked quietly along the street. Well-dressed representatives walked the shoreline, measuring, photographing, asking pointed questions the HOA could no longer dodge. The confident smiles that once defined board meetings disappeared. Replaced by silence, hurried phone calls, and closed-door conversations. That same evening, my attorney received a call requesting a private meeting. The investor wasn't angry at me. They were alarmed. Millions of dollars had already been committed based on written assurances that turned out to be false. Development timelines, marketing campaigns, and projected returns were now meaningless. My attorney explained the situation calmly, presenting verified ownership records and tax histories. There was no argument. Only disbelief. The next morning, the HOA president appeared at my door alone. No cameras. No bylaws. No authority. Her tone had shifted completely. She spoke about misunderstandings, cooperation, and compromise. She suggested shared usage, partnerships, even a buyout at a reasonable price. I listened politely, then declined. I reminded her that I had never sought conflict. Every escalation had come from the HOA's refusal to verify facts. What she didn't realize was that the situation had already moved beyond negotiation. The investor had issued a formal demand letter to the HOA, citing breach of contract, misrepresentation, and financial damages. The number attached to that demand was staggering. $8.2 million. It represented lost investment, penalties, legal fees, and projected revenue. And it was only the opening position. Panic set in. Board members resigned overnight. Emergency emails flooded inboxes. Homeowners demanded explanations. The HOA's insurance provider declined coverage, citing intentional misconduct. Legal counsel withdrew unless paid upfront. Accounts were frozen pending investigation. The lake, once treated as a casual amenity, became the center of every problem. Signs quietly disappeared. Events were cancelled. Access rules were removed. The authority that once felt absolute vanished almost instantly when exposed to documentation. And through it all, I continued fishing. Not as provocation, but as proof. Proof that ownership doesn't require shouting. It requires patience, records, and the willingness to stand still while others panic. The HOA had tried to regain control through pressure and deals. Instead, they triggered consequences that could not be negotiated away. The mistake was no longer theoretical. It had a dollar amount, a paper trail, and a timeline rushing toward court. Court filings arrived in waves, each one heavier than the last. First came the investor's lawsuit against the HOA, outlining misrepresentation, breach of contract, and reliance damages in stark detail. Then individual board members were named personally, their titles offering no protection. Within days, a group of homeowners filed a class action, claiming they were sold properties under false promises of guaranteed lake access and community ownership. I was no longer treated as a problem. I was treated as evidence. Attorneys requested copies of my records, tax receipts, and correspondence. Depositions were scheduled. Sitting under oath, I answered calmly, repeating the same facts again and again. I never claimed the lake publicly. I never stopped anyone from enjoying it. I simply owned it, legally and quietly, while the HOA spoke loudly without checking. The judge moved quickly. A temporary injunction barred the HOA from advertising, controlling, or profiting from the lake in any form. Security barriers were ordered removed. Notices were sent to residents clarifying ownership. In one ruling, years of assumed authority evaporated. The lake was officially recognized as private property, and the HOA was warned against further interference. Behind the scenes, finances unraveled. HOA accounts were frozen pending audit. Vendors demanded payment. Legal bills mounted hourly. Insurance carriers formally denied coverage, citing intentional acts and prior knowledge. Without protection, every dollar of liability pointed directly at the board members who had signed the agreements. Settlement talks began and collapsed just as fast. The investor demanded full repayment and damages. Homeowners demanded refunds and fee reductions. The HOA had nothing left to leverage. Their power structure, once rigid and intimidating, now existed only on outdated letterhead and broken email chains. One afternoon, I received an apology letter. It acknowledged mistakes, asked for understanding, and requested my public support to help reduce damages. My attorney advised silence. Apologies don't undo contracts, and support doesn't erase losses. The damage was already quantified. When the number became public, it stunned everyone. $8.2 million. Not hypothetical. Not inflated. Confirmed losses tied directly to the lake. Property values dipped overnight. For sale signs appeared. The HOA announced dissolution under court supervision, its authority officially stripped. The irony was impossible to ignore. Had they never called the police, none of this would have happened. I would have kept fishing quietly. Instead, their attempt to assert control exposed everything they never owned. Neighbors watched quietly as certainty turned into consequences, realizing rules mean nothing without ownership, and that unquestioned confidence can bankrupt communities faster than any storm, lawsuit, or market crash ever could. When power replaces verification and documentation disappears entirely everywhere. This chapter ended with a lesson the neighborhood would never forget: authority borrowed from assumption collapses the moment truth demands proof. With the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood entered a strange period of silence. No emails. No warning notices. No rule updates taped to mailboxes. For years, residents had lived under constant oversight, and now it was suddenly gone. Some felt relieved. Others felt exposed. But everyone felt the absence of authority they once assumed was permanent. The court appointed an independent administrator to unwind what remained of the HOA. Dues collection stopped immediately. Contracts were terminated. Every financial decision made over the past several years was audited line by line. What investigators uncovered went far beyond the lake. Inflated maintenance contracts. Unapproved expenses. Decisions made without votes. The lake had not been an isolated mistake. It was simply the most expensive one. Former board members began distancing themselves from one another. Some claimed they were misled. Others insisted they had trusted legal counsel. None of that mattered. Signatures were signatures. Responsibility followed ink, not excuses. Retirement funds were liquidated. Second homes were sold. The $8.2 million loss stopped being an abstract headline and became a personal reality for the people who once enforced fines with confidence. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Without an HOA acting as intermediary, conversations replaced complaints. Issues were handled face to face. Disagreements still occurred, but they no longer hid behind authority letters or threats. The community didn't collapse without rules. It adapted. Several residents approached me directly, not with demands, but with apologies. Some admitted they had assumed I was wrong simply because the HOA sounded official. Others said they had been afraid to question anything for fear of penalties. I accepted the apologies quietly. This was never about being right. It was about truth eventually surfacing, whether people were ready or not. Developers, city representatives, and even local organizations reached out to me with offers to buy or lease the lake. The numbers were significant. Life-changing, even. I considered each proposal carefully, weighing money against meaning. In the end, I declined them all. I placed legal protections on the property to prevent development and limit usage to peaceful recreation by permission only. The decision surprised many people. They expected profit. What they didn't understand was that money had never been the motivation. Control had been forced upon me by others, and I refused to repeat the same mistake in reverse. One evening, as the sun lowered and the water turned copper, I stood where the police lights once flashed. No crowds. No tension. Just quiet. In that stillness, I realized something important. This wasn't a story about victory. It was a story about restraint. About what happens when someone refuses to abuse power simply because they finally have it. The lake returned to what it had always been. Water. Land. Calm. And in doing so, it reminded everyone watching that authority should protect communities, not dominate them, and that ownership without responsibility is just another form of misuse waiting to collapse when tested by truth and time. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly reshaped itself around the absence of control. Without an HOA, there was no single voice claiming authority, and that forced people to think for themselves. Some expected chaos. It never came. Instead, something quieter happened. Responsibility shifted back to individuals, and with it came a surprising sense of balance. I noticed fewer arguments, not more. When issues arose, neighbors spoke directly instead of hiding behind complaint forms. Lawn disputes ended in conversations. Noise issues ended in compromises. The fear that once kept everyone compliant had vanished, and in its place was something far more stable: mutual awareness. People were careful now, not because they were threatened, but because they understood consequences. The story of the lake continued to travel. Nearby communities reached out, asking questions about deeds, easements, and governance. Some HOAs paused planned expansions. Others ordered independent audits of their own property claims. No one wanted to become the next example of what happens when assumptions replace verification. My situation had become a warning told quietly at board meetings and legal seminars. I was invited to speak at a local property rights workshop, not as an activist, but as a case study. I declined the spotlight but allowed my documents to be used anonymously. Facts didn't need my face attached to them. They only needed to exist. The lesson was simple: authority does not create ownership, and repetition does not make a claim true. One afternoon, I received a message from a former HOA board member. It wasn't defensive or angry. It was reflective. They admitted they had never once questioned the lake's ownership because it had always been spoken of as communal. We inherited the assumption, they wrote, and enforced it without checking. That admission mattered more than any apology I'd received before. The lake itself remained unchanged. Birds returned. Fish multiplied. Seasons passed without caring who once argued over access. Watching that constancy made something clear. Human conflict is loud but temporary. Truth is quiet and patient. It waits. Sometimes I think about that morning again: the police lights, the crowd, the certainty in the HOA president's voice. I don't feel anger anymore. I feel clarity. That moment forced honesty into a system built on convenience. It revealed how easily people surrender judgment when something sounds official enough. Now, when I fish, people sometimes join me. They ask permission. I grant it freely. Not because I have to, but because trust rebuilt slowly is stronger than authority imposed suddenly. The lake became a place of understanding, not entitlement. What happened here didn't just end in HOA. It changed how an entire community thought about power. And that change carried forward, quietly influencing decisions long after the headlines faded. But every story has a final reflection, one that explains why it mattered beyond property lines. And that reflection was still waiting to be spoken clearly. The wider impact revealed itself slowly, in ways no lawsuit ever could. Real estate agents began rewriting listings, removing vague phrases like shared amenities and replacing them with verified ownership disclosures. Title companies adjusted their procedures. County offices reported a rise in public record requests. People had learned, the hard way, that clarity before conflict is cheaper than confidence after a mistake. Letters and messages arrived from strangers far beyond the neighborhood. Some were HOA members elsewhere, afraid of fines or threats. Others were quiet homeowners who suspected something was wrong but didn't know where to start. They all asked versions of the same question: what do I do if authority says one thing, but my instincts say another? I answered when I could, always repeating the same advice. Check records. Stay calm. Document everything. Truth doesn't need speed. It needs accuracy. One message stood out. It came from a retired county clerk who had spent decades filing deeds no one ever read. She thanked me for reminding people that records exist for a reason. Paper doesn't shout, she wrote. But it never forgets. That sentence captured everything the HOA had ignored. They relied on noise, repetition, and confidence, while truth waited quietly in filing cabinets. The former board members continued to feel the aftermath. Some struggled to find new positions once background checks revealed litigation tied to fraud. Others moved away entirely, unable to escape the reputation. The consequences followed them not because of malice, but because responsibility leaves footprints. Titles disappear. Records remain. For me, the lake became something different than it had ever been. It was no longer a secret I kept for peace, or a battleground forced into the open. It became a reminder. Every time I stood at the water's edge, I remembered how easily people confuse permission with ownership, and how quickly systems fail when no one asks basic questions. On the anniversary of the incident, I returned to the exact spot where the police cars had once parked. The water was calm. The air was quiet. No one watched. No one challenged me. And that silence felt earned, not fragile. It existed because everything was finally honest. I realized then that the true cost of the HOA's mistake wasn't just financial. It was trust. Trust between neighbors. Trust in leadership. Trust in assumptions that had never been tested. Rebuilding that took time, but it began with one undeniable fact placed in the open. The lake didn't care who learned the lesson. But people did. And many carried it forward into decisions they would make for the rest of their lives, long after the story stopped being told out loud. One final chapter remained, not to describe conflict, but to explain meaning. Because stories like this only matter if they leave something behind worth remembering. When everything finally settled, there was no dramatic ending, no celebration, and no sense of triumph. The final court order arrived quietly, confirming what had already been proven beyond doubt. The lake was mine. The HOA's authority was gone. The $8.2 million loss was officially recorded, not as revenge, but as consequence. It marked the end of an organization built on assumption and the beginning of accountability that could not be appealed away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. There is a difference. Victory seeks applause. Grounding seeks balance. What mattered most was not that I was right, but that the truth held steady under pressure. It didn't bend to shouting, titles, or intimidation. It waited, documented, and patient, until it was forced into the open. Over time, the neighborhood found a new rhythm. Without an HOA, people learned to speak directly, resolve issues honestly, and verify before assuming. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real systems, unlike artificial authority, can adapt without collapsing. The lake became part of that balance, no longer a symbol of control, but of clarity. I'm often asked what the lesson is. People expect something dramatic. A warning. A slogan. The truth is simpler. Never confuse confidence with correctness. Never assume ownership without proof. And never underestimate how expensive a small lie can become when everyone agrees not to question it. If the HOA had asked one question years earlier, none of this would have happened. If they had checked one record, verified one deed, or listened instead of threatened, the lake would have remained just water. Instead, they chose authority over accuracy. And that choice cost them everything. I still fish there. Same shoreline. Same quiet mornings. But now, each cast carries perspective. Not pride. Perspective. The understanding that peace isn't maintained by silence forever. Sometimes, peace requires clarity, even when clarity feels uncomfortable. This story wasn't about defeating an HOA. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop assuming someone else has already checked the facts. It was about the danger of repeating something until it sounds true. And it was about how quickly power collapses when it's built on convenience instead of verification. The HOA called the cops expecting compliance. What they triggered instead was exposure. Exposure of a mistake so large it rewrote lives, dissolved authority, and reshaped an entire community's understanding of power. In the end, the lake didn't change. The water stayed calm. The land stayed firm. What changed was awareness. And that awareness, once earned, doesn't fade easily. So if there's one thing worth remembering, it's this: truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs one moment to be seen.